My name is Elena. I'm 29 years old, and this is what really happened. The candles were low and expensive, the kind that never quite looked melted, only curated. Soft jazz moved through the restaurant like it had no deadlines and no consequences. Light slid across polished wine glasses, silverware, cufflinks, the tiny diamond studs in a woman's ears 2 tables over, and finally landed on the wedding band still on my hand because, at that exact hour, I still believed marriage was something that could be humiliated without being broken. We were in Back Bay, in a restaurant Grant liked because the waiters knew how to disappear, and the check arrived in a leather folder that made ordinary money look embarrassed. Butter poached lobster, dry-aged ribeye, tiny potatoes arranged like they had been individually coached. My husband, Grant Carter, sat at the center of the table with the lazy confidence of a man who believed attention was his natural climate. His investors laughed a little too quickly at his jokes. His colleagues watched him with the charged patience people reserve for someone they believe is about to become even more important than he already thinks he is. It was our 4th anniversary. He had called it strategic. I remember the cool weight of the fork in my hand, the linen napkin across my knees, the scent of citrus and smoke from someone's cocktail drifting past the table. I remember the way Grant leaned back in his chair, glass lifted, one elbow loose, smile polished, charming from across a room, cruel from 6 inches away, the kind of smile that always seemed to ask whether anyone would dare challenge the version of events he had already decided to sell. "She's temporary," he said lightly. "Life is long." A few people gave that thin, strained laugh people use when they are not sure whether they have just heard a joke or a warning. Nobody quite looked at me. Nobody quite looked away either. I kept my face still. Not because I was numb, because something in me had already started rearranging itself, sharp and quiet and irreversible. Not a shattering, more like a deadbolt sliding into place. Across from us sat Richard Ellis, a private banker in one of those dark blue ties that make older men look more careful than wealthy, even when they are both. He had met me twice before at events Grant called useful. He lowered his gaze into his glass, then lifted it again and cleared his throat in a way that was too deliberate to be accidental. "Given the timing," he said carefully, "temporary may not be the right word." Grant smiled without looking at him. "Richard, don't rescue me. I'm joking." Richard did look at him then. "I'm referring to the trust maturity review." Grant's smile stayed on his face for a second too long. Mine vanished instantly. The jazz kept playing. Someone at the bar laughed too loudly at something unrelated. A waiter passed carrying oysters over ice. I remember thinking how offensive it was that the room did not stop, that everybody else's night kept moving while mine had just cracked open in the center like something under too much pressure. Grant set his glass down. "What trust maturity review?" Richard's eyes moved to me. He knew, in that instant, that he had stepped into a private family matter that had not been meant for public air. He also knew he was already too far in to step back cleanly. "The Ashcroft Trust," he said. "Your wife's." Grant turned slowly. I had not used my grandfather's last name in years. My mother had. My grandmother had. I hadn't. Grant once called old money dead money and said family trusts turned adults into decorative furniture. At the time, I had thought love made certain corrections unnecessary. I had thought not clarifying was the same thing as being evolved, mature, uninterested in status. I put my fork down with more care than I had put into any movement all week. "I don't know what you mean," I said. Richard blinked. "You weren't informed?" "No." Grant laughed, but the sound had strain inside it now. "Elena freelances," he said to the table. "Her family doesn't exactly have some trust fund sitting around." Richard went still in that deeply professional way certain men do when they realize one person in the room has been living off assumptions they should never have been allowed to make. "I think," he said, "this may be a conversation for another setting." Grant gave a small shrug, like he was indulging a confusion that could not possibly threaten him. No, you opened the door." Richard folded his hands. "The Ashcroft Family Trust was established through probate after Harold Ashcroft's estate passed through Suffolk County Probate Court. Its next control stage is scheduled for review on November 14th. Beneficiary authority remains solely with Ms. Elena Ashcroft Carter." No one laughed that time. What happened was worse. People stopped arranging their faces. Their politeness slipped and curiosity took its place. It was not dramatic. It was not theatrical. It was simply the moment every person at that table became honest enough to stop pretending they were not watching. Grant said, "That can't be right." Richard answered, "It is." My husband looked at me with the expression of a man who feels betrayed by information for existing without reporting to him first. I looked back and understood, with a coldness that later became useful, that he was not shocked I might have money. He was shocked he had not known before now, shocked he had been building his future in a room with an undisclosed wall. I left before dessert. He followed me onto the sidewalk with his coat half on and his voice already sharp with the kind of low anger men use when they want to make a public humiliation sound like a private misunderstanding. Newbury Street glowed under storefront lights and February cold. My heels clicked against wet pavement. His shoes slapped faster behind me. Elena. I kept walking. Elena, stop acting dramatic. That made me stop. Not because he ordered me to, because dramatic was almost funny after temporary. I turned to him. You called me temporary in front of 8 people. He ran a hand across his mouth. It was a joke. No, it was a test. His eyes narrowed. A test of what? Of how much disrespect I would swallow in public. A couple passed us, carrying shopping bags, looking determinedly away. Somewhere down the block, a car horn tapped twice. Grant stepped closer, lowering his voice as if volume control could improve content. What exactly did Richard mean? My banker? You know what I mean. I held his gaze. I didn't know what he meant. He studied my face, trying to locate fear, trying to find the soft part he was used to pressing when he needed the conversation to tilt his way. Grant had always been very good at reading insecurities. It was one of his real talents. He could walk into a room, find the bruise in any person there, and touch it without leaving fingerprints. That night, for the first time, he looked unsure where mine was. Come home, he said. We'll talk there. Home was a glass-walled apartment in Seaport, with a harbor view we were supposedly stretching to afford on his founder's salary and my freelance income. At least that was the story I had been given. He used words like burn rate and bridge round and lean runway with the solemnity other people reserve for weather systems or medical diagnoses. He told people startup life required sacrifice. He told me my design work would always be more stable than it looked if I learned how to package it better. He told investors I kept him grounded. He told friends I was low maintenance, which I later understood was not a compliment but a management note. When we got inside, he poured himself whiskey and forgot to offer me anything. That was how I knew he was genuinely rattled. What else don't I know? He asked. I took off my earrings and set them on the kitchen counter. Interesting question. Elena. You first. He stared. There is no first. Richard made a mistake. Then why are your hands shaking? He glanced down, irritated that his body had gone unscripted. Because now I have investors who think my wife hid assets from me. There it was. Not concern. Not embarrassment for what he had said at dinner. Not any instinct to repair. Just positioning. Reputation. Optics. Narrative ownership. I walked to the window. Harbor lights floated in the black like something clean and distant and expensive. My reflection hovered in the glass between the city and the water. When were you planning to tell me I was temporary? I asked. He exhaled hard. You are turning one stupid line into a crisis. No, the line just revealed the crisis. We've been off for months. I turned back. That sentence was ready. That was not a man improvising. He leaned against the island. You want honesty? Fine. I've been carrying this marriage for a while. I almost laughed, but something about the word carrying stopped it. Men like Grant love verbs that make them sound burdened by the very people who have been making their lives possible in invisible ways. Have you? I said. Yes. In what sense? He gave me a look that suggested my question itself was beneath the level of our problem. Financially, socially, structurally, I've been the one building. I thought about the lease paperwork I had read line by line because he never did. The taxes I had flagged for his accountant. The dinner with his mother I had smoothed after he forgot her birthday call. The registration I renewed. The insurance forms I handled. The fact that our refrigerator was stocked because I noticed when things ran out and he never had to. The holiday flights, the condolence flowers, the dentist appointment reminders, the contractor calls, the carefully calibrated emotional weather system of his life that he got to live inside because I maintained it without applause. You built your certainty on my silence, I said. That's not the same as you building alone. We slept in separate rooms that night, or rather, he slept in the bedroom and I sat awake on the couch with a blanket over my legs and the city turning silver black outside. Around 2 a.m, I searched state probate records. Around 2:30, I recovered an old email login my grandfather had once set up for me as a joke when I was in college. Around 3, I found 2 unread notices from a law office with the subject line Annual Beneficiary Contact Failed, Second Notice. One had been sent months earlier. One had been resent. Both had waited in an inbox I had forgotten existed. At 6:13, before sunrise, I found the first lawyer email on Grant's laptop. He had left it open on the dining table beside a yellow legal pad and a Starbucks cup ring. I am not proud of looking. I am also not sorry. The subject line read, Post-close personal transition planning. I clicked. There were 4 emails in the thread. One was from Grant to a divorce attorney asking about timing relative to anticipated liquidity event and marital optics. Another asked whether a spouse with inconsistent freelance earnings could reasonably claim dependence if the husband was publicly framed as the primary financial engine. One line had been underlined in the reply. Do not commingle newly secured capital with marital personal accounts prior to filing. I read it 3 times. Then I opened the next email. It was to Vanessa, saved as VR strategy. The preview line was enough even before I opened it. Once the funding closes, I can finally untangle this. I stood in our bright kitchen while the espresso machine hummed awake and understood something that should have been obvious sooner. The anniversary dinner had not been careless. It had been rehearsal. He had already started trying on a version of himself that no longer included me. Temporary had not been a slip. It had been a preview. When he came out in gray sweats, he saw me standing there and knew instantly. His gaze moved from my face to the laptop and back again. Elena. I said, how long? He did not ask what I meant. You went through my emails. You were planning your divorce around your funding close. He straightened. My company is in due diligence. Every personal risk factor matters. Personal risk factor. You know what I mean. I do now. He put both hands on the chair in front of him. You've been drifting for over a year. It was so rehearsed I could practically hear the attorney who had helped him refine it. Drifting, I repeated. You're never fully in anything. Some freelance projects, half-finished ideas. No stable path. I can't keep being responsible for both of us. There are moments when insult becomes clarity. Not because it stops hurting, because it finally organizes everything that hurt before it. I saw, all at once, the private architecture of our marriage. How often he had corrected my tone rather than his behavior. How often he had described my work as flexible when he meant optional. How easily he had accepted care without ever classifying it as labor. How deeply he needed me to be slightly smaller than whatever room he was selling himself in. You're not leaving because I drifted, I said. You're leaving because you thought I had no edges. He looked annoyed, which told me I was close to the truth. This marriage hasn't been working. That must be why you brought a banker to our anniversary dinner. That was for investor relations. Everything is. For 2 days after that, I said almost nothing. Grant mistook quiet for weakness. Men like him often do. They assume silence is surrender because they only understand speech as pressure. They never consider that some people go quiet when they have stopped negotiating emotionally and started measuring. I called my mother first. She still lived in Worcester in the same blue-sided house where the hallway smelled faintly like cinnamon, old books, and radiator heat in winter. She answered on the second ring. Sweetheart? Did Grandpa leave me a trust? Silence, then a careful inhale. Yes. I closed my eyes. You knew? Yes. Why didn't you tell me? Because he didn't want it shaping your choices before you were ready. And because the attorneys said there were disclosure windows and contact procedures. You were supposed to be informed, at least formally. I sat on the edge of the guest bed. Mom, Grant is planning to leave me after his funding closes. Her voice changed instantly, softer, sharper, focused. Do you have proof? Yes. Good. Keep it somewhere he cannot access. My grandfather, Harold Ashcroft, had made his money in the least glamorous way possible. Industrial supply contracts, municipal maintenance equipment, parts no one bragged about, sold to systems no one photographed, profitable for 4 decades. He believed flashy men often mistook visibility for worth. He believed women in our family should never be one bad man away from fear. When I was 12, he once handed me a spare house key and said, "Never confuse being loved with being trapped." At 12, I rolled my eyes. At 29, I wrote it down. By Friday, I was in a conference room on State Street with a trust attorney named Miriam Song. Flat shoes, clean desk, no wasted words. The conference room looked down over traffic, old stone facades, and the corner of a church that seemed too dignified to notice what happened in law offices nearby. On the table sat 2 binders, a yellow legal pad, a sweating bottle of water, and a neat stack of documents that somehow made my life look both more protected and more exposed than it ever had. Miriam read the trust summary with me line by line. Beneficiary, Elena Marie Ashcroft. Current legal name, Elena Marie Ashcroft Carter. Access control, beneficiary sole authority. Spousal claim restrictions, complete absent express witnessed authorization. Trustee review stage, active upon maturity date. She slid 1 page toward me. Your grandfather was very specific. That sounds like him. No spouse, current or future, may claim direct or indirect control, contingent access, managerial presumption, or derivative expectation over trust principal, trust-controlled real property, or affiliated business interests without separately notarized beneficiary authorization. I looked up. Derivative expectation? It means no one gets to build a fantasy budget around your inheritance. Something in me settled then, not emotionally, but structurally. Like a beam had been identified inside a wall, and I finally knew where the load was. Miriam asked, "Did your husband ever contribute capital to any trust-linked asset?" "I don't know." "We'll find out." Then she asked, "Has he ever represented your trust as likely support to anyone?" I thought of the apartment, the sudden confidence about future property, the casual questions about my family's old land in Vermont. The way he had begun using phrases like next phase and long-term residential strategy as if he were already discussing assets he did not own. "I think maybe yes." She nodded once. "Then we move fast." There is a kind of grief that arrives wearing administrative clothing. You are not sobbing on a bathroom floor. You are opening accounts, scanning documents, changing passwords, printing emails, signing storage authorization forms, opening a P.O. box, forwarding records, meeting a notary, telling a receptionist your married name while privately deciding how much longer you plan to keep it. That spring, my life became folders. I copied every household financial document I could legally access. I saved screenshots to an encrypted drive and another physical backup in my mother's safe. I printed key emails because paper matters more than people admit when someone later starts describing your memory as emotional interpretation. I also started paying attention to the small lies. Grant told me he was in New York for a founder summit. His toll history said Cambridge, then South End. Grant told me a lease extension discussion was routine. The landlord file showed reference to anticipated family trust support. Grant suggested we revisit the prenup for future tax efficiency, which was a polished way of asking what I might sign away if he smiled while requesting it. One Sunday, he left his phone on the counter while he showered. A message lit up from Vanessa. "Need a clean story before Austin asks about the wife." I did not touch the phone. I did not need to. The sentence was enough. Austin turned out to be Austin Bell, lead partner in the funding round. I learned that at another dinner, this one at a hotel bar near the financial district. Grant had invited me because public marriage optics had become useful again. I went because there is power in showing up once you understand the room differently. Austin was younger than I expected. Sharp haircut, expensive watch. Texas confidence smoothed into Boston Polish. He ordered bourbon and spoke about scaling like it was a moral virtue. Halfway through appetizers, he turned to me. "Grant says you're the stabilizer." Grant smiled across the table. "She keeps me sane." I smiled back. "That's one version." Austin laughed. "You involved in the next phase?" Grant answered before I could. "Not directly. Elena's more on the creative side." I let a beat pass. "I'm involved anywhere legal ownership requires my signature." Grant's jaw tightened so slightly most people would have missed it. I did not. Austin looked between us. "Good to know." That was the start of the crack in Grant's investor narrative. Tiny, elegant. Enough! A week later, Miriam confirmed something larger. The apartment application had included statements and implications built around anticipated family trust support and spousal side future capital stability. Not outright fraud. That would have been cleaner. This was more slippery. Strategic implication. Enough to impress a landlord. Enough to become very interesting once reviewed in a legal context. "Can he do that?" I asked. "He can imply anything he likes," Miriam said. "The question is whether he survives discovery when implication meets documentation." So I stayed quiet. Quiet is not passive. Quiet is expensive. Quiet is learning the difference between anger and leverage. Quiet is smiling over dinner while your attorney reviews cap table movement in another office. Quiet is keeping your voice calm when the man across from you brings home tulips because he senses weather but not the direction of the storm. Grant did become gentler as the funding close approached. That was almost the cruelest part. He brought flowers, asked if I wanted to go to Maine in May, sent me links to rentals described as restorative and intimate. He offered to replace the chipped pan in the kitchen. He asked if I wanted to redo the bedroom. Sometimes betrayal gets loud. Sometimes it comes home with produce from Whole Foods and asks whether you need anything before Monday. One night he came in with a small blue Tiffany bag and set it beside my laptop. "What's this?" I asked. "A reset." Inside was a bracelet delicate enough to look harmless. I closed the box. "Why now?" He shrugged, aiming for casual warmth. "We've both been stressed." "Grant." He met my eyes. Not warmly, carefully. "Are you trying to make me easier to leave?" I asked. Something hardened in his face. "You think everything is war." "No," I said. "Just this." The funding round closed in late April. He came home glowing with victory, dropped his leather weekender by the door, opened champagne I had not bought, and kissed my forehead like I was a child or a niece or a good luck charm he had already mentally packed away. "We did it," he said. "No," I thought. "You did what you planned to do." That night, after he fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen island and read the public announcement. Carter Dynamics had secured $12 million in Series A financing. Local startup media called Grant disciplined, magnetic, trusted. I stared at trusted for a very long time. 2 days later, a courier arrived with divorce papers. Grant was not home when they came. Maybe that was logistics. Maybe cowardice. Either way, the envelope felt heavier than paper should. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Temporary support waiver requested. Property classification motion pending. There it was again. Temporary. He really did think words could do his labor for him. Miriam met me that afternoon. He's moving fast, she said. He thinks speed is control. He's also trying to frame most meaningful future upside as separate to him and most household obligation history as mutual to you. Which is ambitious. I laughed once. Dryly. Efficient. She handed me another folder. We're responding with full disclosure requests, preservation notices, and a trust protection filing. Also, there's more. Inside was a report from a forensic accountant she had engaged. Grant had been using company resources to cover personal expenses while preaching clean founder discipline to investors. Travel overlap, layered meals. Consulting fees routed through a shell LLC with Vanessa's initials embedded in filing history. Nothing theatrical enough for headlines. Just dirty enough to matter once light hit it properly. My stomach dipped, then steadied. Can they see this? In mediation, if we choose. In litigation, absolutely. Timing is the real question. Timing became everything. The case hit Suffolk County Family and Probate Court with a case number so ordinary it felt insulting. Years of erosion reduced to digits. That is one of adulthood's cruel little jokes. The worst things in your life often arrive labeled as if they are inventory. Grant texted me that night. We can do this amicably if you stay reasonable. I stared at it for a full minute before replying. I plan to stay exact. He never answered. Mediation was scheduled in June in an office near the courthouse with gray walls, bad coffee, a fake ficus tree in one corner, and a thermostat that made everyone slightly uncomfortable on purpose. Grant arrived in a navy suit and the expression men like him practice for situations where they need to appear both dignified and misunderstood. His attorney spoke first. A polished woman with an expensive haircut and the tone of someone used to reframing appetite as inevitability. She described him as an ambitious founder navigating exceptional pressure. She described me as a talented but intermittent freelancer whose marriage had become misaligned with reality. She spoke of respectful transition, separate trajectories, emotional incompatibility. She made it all sound like weather. Like no one had chosen anything. Like certain marriages simply passed away from atmospheric conditions. Miriam did not raise her voice when it was our turn. She never needed to. She began with the trust, dates, filings, clauses, authority restrictions, protected structures. She established that the Ashcroft Trust had existed before my marriage, remained protected throughout it, and had never once been accessible to Grant by law, by custom, by presumption, or by future fantasy. Then she introduced the apartment materials, the lease representations, and the internal references to anticipated family trust support. Grant interrupted. That was never presented as guaranteed. Miriam turned one page. You may explain your phrasing after I read it. She read from a prep note in his own documents. Residential stability supported by spouse-side family trust maturity Q4. The mediator looked up. Supported by what exactly? Miriam answered. By an asset he did not own, could not access, and appears to have referenced repeatedly in anticipatory planning. Grant shifted in his chair. That was shorthand. The mediator said, For what? He did not answer. Then Richard Ellis spoke. He had joined later by agreement as a records witness tied to the trust administration. He brought a thin folder and the controlled air of a man who had spent decades explaining money to people who thought confidence counted as access. For clarity, he said, the Ashcroft Trust was never jointly accessible. It was never available for spousal draw. It was never available as presumed collateral or marital backing. Beneficiary authority belonged solely to Ms. Carter. Grant leaned forward. But once married, Richard looked at him with something I think Grant found harder to bear than hostility. Professional pity. Mr. Carter, he said calmly, the trust was never yours to access. I watched Grant's face lose structure, not composure, structure. The internal architecture of certainty simply gave way. That should have been enough. It wasn't. Because once the financial assumptions fell apart, the rest of his narrative began sliding too. Miriam introduced the forensic review, company expense overlap, shell structures, personal planning embedded in professional timing, divorce planning emails written before the funding close, public posture versus private strategy. She placed the documents in sequence and let the chronology do the humiliating work. Grant's attorney asked for a break. In the hallway, I stood beside a vending machine holding a paper cup of water. My hands were steady again, always steady. By then, that had become my private sign that something final was happening. Grant came out alone 5 minutes later. Elena, I didn't turn immediately. Then I did. He looked tired for the first time in months. Not humbled. Not heartbroken. Just abruptly human. You set this up, he said. No, I answered. You did. I just stopped protecting you from the shape of it. He dragged a hand through his hair. You could have talked to me. I tried. You called me temporary. It was one sentence. No, it was the sentence that matched the rest. He glanced back toward the room, then at me. What do you want? I thought about it. Not dramatically, practically. I want my name off your story. He stared, and I think that was the first moment he understood the actual loss. Not the money. Not the legal exposure, the loss of access to the person who had been translating his ambition into shelter. Settlement took another 3 weeks. He waived any claim connected to trust-linked or trust-adjacent assets. He accepted liability tied to misleading financial representations where documentation existed. His attorneys fought over wording, fought over sequencing, fought over implication, but investors become much less romantic when paper enters the room. Austin Bell called me directly once, which surprised everyone, most of all me. I think there may have been assumptions in our diligence environment, he said. That's a polished sentence. Pause. Yes. I was standing in line at Target while he spoke. Dish soap, printer paper, new towels in my cart. The woman ahead of me was buying paper plates shaped like lemons. A little boy 2 lines over was asking for gummy worms. That was what I liked best about the call. The absolute ordinariness of my surroundings while a venture capitalist carefully discovered that charisma is not due diligence. You're asking whether Grant misrepresented financial backing, I said. I'm asking whether we should be concerned. You should ask your counsel what he documented versus what he implied. He exhaled. Understood. By July, concern had turned into consequence. Carter Dynamics did not collapse in one cinematic afternoon. Real collapses rarely do. They thin out. Meetings get postponed. Expansion becomes review. Review becomes caution. Caution becomes silence. One executive starts taking lunches elsewhere. Another updates his resume at midnight. Somebody on the board begins using the phrase governance clarity in emails that no one would have written 3 months earlier. Then came the share issue. This is the part people always want to sound more glamorous than it was. It wasn't. No triumphant soundtrack. No scene at an office. No applause. Just numbers meeting weakness at the right moment. An early secondary shareholder needed liquidity once board turbulence started tightening around the company. Through a trust-controlled LLC Miriam helped structure cleanly, I acquired a minority block of distressed shares. Not enough for control. Enough for visibility. Enough for leverage. Enough for irony so sharp I laughed alone in my car outside a Walmart in Quincy when Miriam confirmed the paperwork had cleared. Not because I was cruel. Because Grant had spent years explaining markets to me over dinner as if I were a pleasant tourist in his world. And now part of the company he had built his future around ran, in part, through an entity tied to the woman he had called temporary. Summer in Boston has a way of making everything look forgiven before it is. Blue Harbor, restaurant patios, white sneakers, iced coffee. Grant moved into a furnished rental in Cambridge and told mutual friends we had grown apart under pressure. Some believed him, some didn't. The ones who mattered stopped assuming his version came first. His mother called me once in August. Elena, she said, voice tight with old New England manners, I'm sure there are 2 sides. There were, I said. Then there were documents. Silence. I softened nothing. I didn't do this to him. I just stopped lying by omission. At Thanksgiving, I went to Worcester. My mother made too many pies. My cousin dropped a crumpled store receipt on the counter beside cranberry sauce and batteries for the TV remote. Football played too loudly in the living room. My uncle mispronounced quinoa on purpose. The day after, I helped string lights along the porch while my fingers went numb in the cold and realized I could breathe all the way down again. Healing is not glamorous. It is changing your mailing address. It is separating subscriptions. It is learning which songs no longer belong in your car. It is deleting a contact and still knowing the number by heart. It is picking up certified copies from the clerk's office and noticing your knees no longer go weak at official stamps. The divorce finalized in December. I wore a camel coat and low heels because the sidewalks were slush and I had lost interest in suffering for elegance. The hearing was brief, administrative, almost insulting in its simplicity. Years of private compromise, manipulation, swallowed insult, strategic performance, invisible labor, public embarrassment, and legal reconstruction reduced to acknowledgments, signatures, and an order entered into record. Outside the courthouse, Grant caught up with me near the steps. He looked older, not dramatically, honestly. His company had survived in reduced form under tighter oversight, but the expansion myth was gone, and so was the atmosphere that had made him look larger than life. You could see the absence of audience on him. Elena, I stopped because I wanted the ending to occur in daylight. He put his hands in his coat pockets. Did you ever love me? It was such a selfish question that I almost smiled. Yes, I said. That's why you got away with so much. He looked down. I made mistakes. Mistakes are forgetting a reservation. He winced. I continued. You built a future around my supposed ignorance. That wasn't a mistake. That was strategy. Wind pushed cold air between us. Cars hissed through wet streets nearby. He said, You didn't have to destroy everything. I answered, I didn't destroy everything. I refused to stay underneath it. He nodded once, barely. You've changed. I looked at him and thought about all the versions of me he had needed. The calm wife. The under-earning creative. The stabilizer. The placeholder. The decorative softness in the background of his ambition. He had mistaken my patience for emptiness. He had mistaken my gentleness for the absence of structure. No, I said. I became visible. That night I returned to the apartment alone, though by then it was no longer ours in any meaningful sense. The lease was ending. I had already arranged a transition to something smaller on Beacon Hill through a trust property path Miriam helped manage cleanly. No confusion. No shared mythology. No future built on the wrong name. I poured a glass of wine and stood at the window. The harbor looked like black silk torn by city light. Somewhere below, a delivery driver buzzed the wrong unit. Somebody laughed in the hallway. A dog barked once and stopped. Life continued with its usual lack of ceremony. I thought about Richard clearing his throat across a candlelit table. About my grandfather building protections for men he would never meet. About my mother knowing and waiting until I was ready to know too. About legal folders, mediation coffee, courthouse stamps, printer paper, and the simple holy power of records kept well. Here is something I understand now. Some men do not marry a woman. They marry the role she plays in the private theater of their ambition. And here is something else. A quiet woman is not an empty one. She is often a woman taking exact measurements. I never screamed at Grant. I never smashed a glass. I never posted a cryptic quote or gave friends the edited version for sympathy circulation. There is no viral clip of my revenge because what happened was not revenge in the childish sense. It was consequence in its adult form, built through signatures, through patience, through timing, through the refusal to speak before the paperwork had become irreversible. That is what made it devastating. He wanted a clean exit with financial dominance and social sympathy. He wanted the company, the narrative, the cleaner future, the pitying friends, the charming explanation, the soft landing onto better furniture. What he got instead was corrected records, investor scrutiny, governance problems, a reduced company, a court file, and the slow public discovery that the future he had privately budgeted around was never his at all. People later asked whether the trust saved me. No, it protected me. That is different. What saved me was accepting humiliation fast enough to use it. I still freelance, though more selectively now. I also sit on 2 boards connected to Ashcroft Holdings, and I ask harder questions than certain men expect from women they once filed under aesthetic. The first time I signed a major approval document without flinching, I thought about standing in line at the DMV renewing Grant's registration, while he pitched himself as indispensable to a room full of men who all wanted to sound like him. Strange, the things memory chooses to frame. The Tiffany bracelet sat in its box for months. Then I sold it. The money paid for a long weekend in Vermont with my mother, where the trees looked too carefully painted to be real and the hotel coffee tasted terrible, but the quiet was worth every inconvenience. On the second morning, over burnt toast and a view of frost lifting off a field, she asked if I regretted not confronting him earlier. No, I said. Why not? Because exposure is not the same as understanding. Because some people only comprehend consequence when it arrives holding documents. Because if I had confronted him too soon, he would have hidden the evidence better and changed the shape of the lie. Because the version of me that demanded emotional honesty would have been dragged into defending feelings, while the version of me that waited got facts. Instead, I simply said, I needed him confident. She nodded like she had expected that answer all along. By the following spring, most people had stopped asking about Grant. Scandal has a short half-life unless fame is involved. At first that bothered me. Then it freed me. I did not need the world to keep punishing him for the truth to remain true. One evening, I ran into Austin Bell at a charity event near the public garden. He looked uneasy in an expensive suit. Elena, he said, I owe you an apology. For what? For believing style was substance. I took a sip of sparkling water. That's a common investor disease. He laughed, then stopped when he realized I had not really been joking. You handled that entire situation with remarkable restraint. No, I said. I handled it with documentation. He lifted his glass slightly. Fair. On my walk home, the air smelled like cut grass and rain. A little girl dropped an ice cream cone at a crosswalk and burst into tears. Her father bought another one immediately. No annoyance, no lesson, just kindness. I stood there waiting for the light and felt something I had not expected. Not triumph, relief without edge. The final irony is this: Grant was right about one thing. Life is long. Long enough for people to reveal the operating system underneath their charm. Long enough for a joke to become evidence. Long enough for a woman to stop shrinking so a man can feel tall. Long enough for you to realize that being underestimated is only dangerous if you keep agreeing with the estimate. I kept my grandfather's last name in business. Ashcroft. I dropped Carter the first week I was legally free to. At the Social Security office, the woman behind the plexiglass asked whether I wanted both names listed anywhere for continuity, and I said no, with such calm certainty that even she smiled. On the walk back to my car, I passed a dark storefront window and caught my reflection. Same face, same hands, new alignment. Temporary, he said. Turns out the only temporary thing in that room was the future he thought he owned, and that is the part people misunderstand when they hear a story like mine. They think the satisfying moment was the anniversary dinner, or the mediation room, or the day the shares cleared, or the look on his face outside the courthouse. Those were moments, yes, sharp ones, useful ones, but the real ending happened much more quietly than that. It happened the first morning I woke up in my new apartment on Beacon Hill and realized no one else's mood had entered the room before I had. The apartment was smaller than the Seaport place, older, quieter. The floors creaked in 2 spots, and the bathroom tile needed regrouting. The windows looked out over brick, black railings, and one determined tree that seemed to survive every season out of pure stubbornness. There was no harbor view, no glass walls, no architectural statement, just rooms with corners that held their own silence well. I made coffee in a kitchen that belonged entirely to me. I opened a cabinet and found exactly what I expected because I had put it there. I stood barefoot in morning light holding a chipped mug from Worcester and felt something settle inside me that had nothing to do with money. Safety, not luxury, not victory. Safety. It is difficult to explain to people who have never lived beside strategic contempt how holy safety can feel. No one was going to call me dramatic for reacting accurately. No one was going to speak over me at dinner and later describe it as charisma. No one was going to turn my quiet into an argument for my irrelevance. No one was going to build a balance sheet around a future version of me he thought he could manage. A few weeks later, Miriam came by with final trust paperwork requiring one more signature in person. She wore the same practical shoes, carried the same impossible aura of competence, and accepted tea but not sugar. "You look better," she said after we had sat down. "I sleep now." "That helps." I signed where she indicated, page after page. Initials on the bottom right corners. One formal adjustment, one board-related disclosure, one property acknowledgement, one governance packet for the LLC that had purchased the distressed shares. When I finished, she stacked the documents neatly and looked at me for a second longer than usual. "Your grandfather built a very defensive structure," she said. "Not everyone appreciates that when they first encounter it." "I do now." She smiled faintly. "Yes, you do." After she left, I stood in the middle of the living room and looked around at half-opened boxes, books stacked on the floor, one lamp not yet assembled, a rolled rug leaning against the wall, and the legal papers cooling on the table. It should have looked unfinished. Instead, it looked honest. That spring I started taking on design work again, but differently. No more vague underpricing because it seemed graceful. No more over-delivering in exchange for being called easy to work with. No more pretending labor was lighter just because it came naturally to me. I rewrote my contracts, raised my rates, added retainers, clarified revision limits. The first man who called my numbers aggressive got an email back so calm it bordered on elegant. My fees reflect scope and precision. If that no longer aligns, I understand. He signed 2 days later. There is a kind of power that enters your life after one betrayal too many. Not bitterness, not hardness, calibration. You stop hoping to be interpreted generously by people committed to misunderstanding anything that costs them comfort. You stop arguing for your own weight in rooms where gravity has already been proven. My mother started visiting once a month. Sometimes she brought soup, sometimes old photographs, sometimes nothing but herself. One Saturday, she found me in the kitchen relabeling file boxes. "You always do this when you're settling," she said. "Do what?" "Make categories." I smiled. "It helps." She looked at the labels. Taxes, trust, board, personal, closed. How do you know when something is closed? I thought about that. When it no longer changes shape every time I touch it. She looked at me then with an expression I knew from childhood. Pride softened by regret. Love arriving a little later than it should have, but real all the same. One rainy evening in May, I got an email from Vanessa. No subject line, no greeting, just 2 paragraphs. I'm sure you don't want to hear from me, and you don't owe me a response. I just want to say that I was not the affair people probably assumed. That doesn't make me innocent. I knew more than I should have tolerated. I believed what he said about the marriage being already over. I also knew he used people when they were useful, and I kept working with him anyway. I left Carter Dynamics in February. You were not wrong about any of it. I read it once and archived it. Not because it meant nothing, because it changed nothing. Some apologies arrived too late to heal, but early enough to confirm. That was enough. By June, the board work had become more substantial. One of the Ashcroft-linked entities needed a vote on a regional expansion decision. The room was mostly men over 50 with expensive watches and a habit of mistaking patience for hesitation. Midway through the discussion, one of them began explaining basic cash flow timing to me in the tone people use for nephews and decorative women. I let him finish. Then I asked 3 questions about debt structure, vendor concentration, and maintenance exposure that caused the room to go completely quiet. After the meeting, one older director caught up with me near the elevator. You hid that well, he said. What? That you're dangerous. I smiled. No, people just assumed I wasn't. That summer I sold the Seaport dining table. The one where I had found the emails. A woman from Somerville came to pick it up with her brother and a rented van. She admired the wood finish, asked if it had ever been refinished, and handed me the cash in an envelope. When the table left, the apartment felt lighter in a way that had nothing to do with floor space. I used part of that money to buy myself something small and unremarkable, a sturdy oak desk for the Beacon Hill apartment. Not expensive, not performative, just solid, deep drawers, good weight. It became the place where I reviewed contracts, answered board packets, wrote proposals, paid bills, and occasionally sat doing nothing at all. I have come to believe that women should own at least one piece of furniture in their lives that exists only to support their minds. By August, Carter Dynamics had faded from local gossip into the less glamorous territory of restructuring. Grant remained in place in title for a while, then not fully in practice. New oversight, reduced discretion. Investors dislike surprises even more than they dislike dishonesty, especially when dishonesty makes them look unserious. We did not speak. Then, on a gray Thursday afternoon in September, I ran into him anyway. It happened outside a coffee shop in Cambridge after a board-related lunch. He was standing by the window, phone in hand, coat over one arm, looking like a man trying very hard not to seem as if he had been reduced by life. He saw me at the same moment. For 1 second, neither of us moved. Then he said, "Elena." I should have kept walking. Instead, I stopped. He looked thinner, or maybe just more exact, less padded by atmosphere. "You look well," he said. "So do you," I lied. He gave a tired half-smile. "You never used to lie badly." I had less practice. That landed. Good. He glanced toward the street. "Can I ask you something?" "You usually did." He accepted that. "Were you always going to become this person?" I almost asked which person he meant. The one with legal counsel? The one with leverage? The one with edges he had refused to see? Instead, I said, "I was always this person. You just preferred a quieter translation." He looked at me for a long second. "I did love you." There it was again. The selfish instinct to preserve his self-image in the final record. "I think," I said, "you loved the version of me that cost you nothing." He lowered his eyes. When he looked back up, something in him had given up the performance at last. Not redemption, just exhaustion. "I'm sorry," he said. This time I believed he meant it. And that changed absolutely nothing. "Take care, Grant," I said. Then I walked away, not fast, not dramatically, just forward. That was the last time I saw him. By the end of that year, my nameplate read Elena Ashcroft on office directories, board materials, and invoices. Every time I saw it, something inside me aligned a little more cleanly. Names are strange. We carry them like weather until one day we realize some of them were costumes and some were keys. I kept the legal folders, but eventually moved them from the daily drawer to the archive box. Not because what happened no longer mattered, because it no longer required daily access. That is how I knew it had finally become history rather than emergency. Sometimes people still tell me I handled it gracefully. That is not the word I would use. Grace suggests softness, suggests an almost effortless virtue. What I had was discipline. Discipline in the face of humiliation. Discipline in the face of performance. Discipline not to confront too early, not to speak too loosely, not to trade leverage for the temporary relief of emotional disclosure. People romanticize emotional honesty. They forget that some situations do not improve when truth is spoken. They improve when truth is documented. And if you ask me now what the real lesson was, it is not that money protects women. Money helps. Structure helps. Good lawyers help. Inherited protections help. But none of those things matter if you are still emotionally committed to misunderstanding what is being done to you. The real lesson is that the first betrayal is often not the insult. It is the moment you are handed evidence and still rush to reinterpret it kindly. I had done that for years, with smaller things, the jokes, the interruptions, the diminishing phrases disguised as observations, low maintenance, flexible, drifting, creative type, not built for numbers, better with people than process. Every one of those little sentences had been a brick in a story I let him build because I believed love meant context. I believed closeness meant generosity. I believed marriage meant that if something felt off, there must be a kinder explanation I was failing to see. There wasn't. Sometimes the mean explanation is the true one. And once you accept that, the world becomes both colder and easier to navigate. Life is long, he said. He was right. Long enough for a woman to hear the sentence meant to reduce her and understand that what really ended in that candlelight was not her marriage. It was her willingness to be translated by someone invested in making her seem small. Long enough for old protections to find their moment. Long enough for paper to outlast performance. Long enough for visibility to arrive without noise. Long enough for a quiet woman to stop being mistaken for an unguarded one. Temporary, he said. But the thing about being underestimated for too long is that one day you stop trying to correct it with words. You let reality do the introduction.